focus on. And obviously, there's a bunch of questions in relation to how does the industrial strategy relate to local growth plans, and how do local growth plans relate to the industrial strategy. So we're going to try and talk in and around that kind of space. And I've got a panel of three brilliant experts, each with their slightly different perspectives on this sort of issue, these kinds of questions, to share some light with us today. We've got Dr. Henry Kippin, who is the Chief Executive of the North East Combined Authority. We've got Victoria Sutherland, who's Deputy Director for Evidence at the What Centre for Local Economic Growth. And we've got Paul Swinney, Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. So we're going to hear from our panelists in turn on a sort of opening remarks, big picture perspective on the industrial strategy, their sort of take on it, having read it and thought about it. Is it any good? Is it progression from previous iterations? Where do we think we are? And then we'll get into a series of questions or series of issues, as I say, mainly around the relationship between the industrial strategy and local growth plans. If you've got questions, queries, comments, if you agree or disagree with the panelists along the way, as always, use the Q&A function, put them in, and I will throw them into the debate and discussion as we go through the next hour, and then we'll be finished at around 1 o'clock. So, Henry, give us your sort of opening remarks around the industrial strategy, what you think in any good, what was missing, how do you think about it from a North East Combined Authority perspective?
Hi everybody, and thank you for the invite. It's great to be here, actually, and partly because we're in the middle of this process, aren't we? And I can't really stand here and say, yes, this is a brilliant thing. Here's what it looks like. Here's what the perfect fit with a local growth plan is, and here's where we're going to be after the SR. We're all in that space where we're working it through. My view personally, and I think the view of colleagues in the region, is that it is a good thing that we have an industrial strategy. I think we've been saying for a long time that the slightly suboptimal plan for growth that the last government brought forward didn't really do it for us in terms of specificity around sectors, even trying to get our head around at a national level, what are we trying to unlock here, and what is the role specifically of the regions within that. So that, I think, is really welcome. I actually think the tone of the discussion has been different and welcome too, in that, very publicly, the PM invited all of the mayors into Downing Street on day, what was it, 3 or 4? Everybody came out clutching their pieces of paper saying, we're going to develop growth plans. And then we've all gone away and done the work to really start to articulate the story of our regions in a way that has not felt like homework marking. It has not felt like a top-down process. That in itself is good, because that starts to flush out some of the interdependencies that I'm sure you'll get into later on in the discussion. And in a way, we're still in the process of working that through. But actually, starting from the position that you absolutely need the regions to be telling their own story with credibility about what's going to drive growth within, say, my local area. You also need a national framework to understand where central government's going to put its resources and how it's going to think about that. And there has to be some relationship between the two. I'm not sure there's a perfect way of doing that, but I feel quite positive about the way that we've started that process. In the North East, there is a really strong link between the work that we've done on industrial growth within the region and more latterly creative sector growth, the way that's played through into our devolution deals, into the investment zone propositions that we've created, and latterly now into the growth plan and industrial strategy. So it feels like a lot of consistency from my point of view. Last thing I would say at the outset, which I think again is really positive, is the recognition which we've had in a number of ways, actually, including from the Secretary of State when he came up to his home city of Sunderland recently, talking about the interdependency between an industrial strategy, and its effectiveness and wider devolution. And you cannot have one without the other, particularly when you're talking about the skills and human capital side of this and some of the enablers for industrial strategy to work. So I think positive start, and we've got to play that through, but I think much better position than we were a few months ago, Andy, and that will be my starting point for the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. I mean, lots in that already, just to think about the different, the relationship between what government is in a sense trying to think about through the industrial strategy, a national perspective in some regards, and then how that plays into what's going on in the ground and on the ground in places such as yours, and the degree to which those things are overlapped or not overlapped, and obviously the other point, which is the relationship between devolution and the powers you have through devolution, and how that fuels and enables creating a condition where any type of industrial strategy interventions are going to be more likely to succeed than not. So we can definitely pick up some of that. And as I said, if you've got questions for our panel, just put them into the Q&A, and we'll pick them up along the way. Victoria, you come in next. So obviously you're coming in from a what works evidence-based perspective. You've done loads of work historically and currently around local industrial strategies back in the day, local growth plans now. Just your general reflections on the industrial strategy, what's in it, what's not in it, to what extent it's taken heed of what the evidence is telling us.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I mean, firstly, I'd echo Henry's point that it's nice to have an industrial strategy again, and actually more broadly, it's nice to have a focus on growth again. I feel like that has definitely been missing over the last few years. I mean, our perception would be that it generally has been quite well received as a document, and I think a good chunk of that is the fact that it seems to be quite a sensible document. You know, it's talking about a lot of things that I think there's not much disagreement about the importance of investing in skills, the importance of innovation, the importance of there being a stable regulatory environment, you know, of trade, etc., etc. So I think in a sense it does a good job of kind of setting out, you know, this is a sensible approach that we're going to take over the course of this parliament, you know, and potentially beyond. So I think all of that's very positive in terms of kind of scene setting. I think there's also some other things in it that I think are quite positive. So it draws on evidence. So it will be of no surprise to anyone that a What Works Centre thinks that's the right way you should go about thinking about these issues.
I hope everybody agrees with that, Victoria.
Well, yeah, me too, but I feel like not everyone does.
You never know, but let's hope so. It's like, yeah, no, it's ignore the evidence and just do whatever we feel like we need to do.
Yeah, so I think that's good. It feels quite a positive document to me as well. It talks about building on positives, building on the assets there already are, the good work that's happening across the country. So I think that's good. And the other thing that I would say is really positive is places are mentioned. Regional growth is mentioned, not just national growth. So I think the fact that there's focus on that is really important. I think if I had a criticism of it, and maybe this is an unfair criticism because it's about the point we're at in the process, is that, you know, it is talking about things, it's talking about principles really. There's not much meat on the bones. It doesn't tell us very much yet about actually what is government going to do, you know, what does it see as the role of the different partners, etc. So in a sense, I think if there's anything to criticise, it's that, you know, that there's not quite enough detail. Although having said that, I also like short documents, so there's always a tension there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and maybe we'll hear from Paul, and then I think, as you said, as well, Henry, we're in the midst of a process. We're not at the end of it, and therefore, you know, all of this stuff is work in progress. So I think we should try to think about anything we say positively or negatively as things to consider, things to keep an eye on, you know, things that we are aware of that we're not criticizing at this point, but we might need to think about this stuff so they don't become problems further down the line as we get closer to white paper and anything afterwards. So, you know, that's a good framing point as well. Paul, let's get your opening remarks and comments.
Grant, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think echoing probably what Henry and Victoria said, there's a number of interesting things that come in the Green Paper, which I think then have implications for how local growth plans are constructed, both in terms of how the combined authorities put them together, but also what the government should be expecting to receive. So what are they in that case? So good things, I think, first off, that growth focus is a good thing. Having something which is designed to try and deal with the challenges the UK economy has faced over the last 15 years is important, because it underpins, I think, a whole range of challenges that the government and society faces. today in terms of both wage increases or paying for public services, etc., etc., etc. So growth good. The Green Paper isn't too specific on sectors. We think that is a good thing. It has identified what we describe as being exporting activities, the tradable base. Definitely that's where we need to be. I think going much beyond that, we start to get a little bit more nervous about the ability of public policy to predict the future. Third one related to that is, while the sector stuff gets quite a lot of the headlines, actually there's quite a lot written about wider drivers, so skills, transport, etc. I think that's where, from City's perspective, we think there's more to be done. Our policy has got more levers to pull in terms of trying to make a difference. And the fourth one is this element of place. And it's interesting to see, I think, how over the different industrial strategies, we have seen this evolution of place from in 2008 under the Peter Mandelson version, sort of a brief mention of regions, but that was it. In 2017, we sort of had a notion of place is important, but not really sure how, and everywhere is basically the same. Through to where we are now, not least I think because of the Levelling Up white paper in between, which developed this thinking, which is that place has got an important role to play. Different places should be playing different roles, and different places have different potentials, and that will guide where the government puts its resources. Probably what that then means, so going off those four things, to think about what it means for local growth plans. I think the first one, going back to that growth target, which is a good thing. When you read the Green Paper, growth itself isn't actually defined. So it just says growth. Well, is that employment growth? Is it output growth? Or is it productivity growth? Now, ultimately, if we're concerned about increasing standards of living, we need to be focused on productivity growth. And that does change the nature of the policies that we might be trying to use, or indeed, if we are going down the sector route, the types of sectors we might well be thinking about. And I think the government being explicit about that and having a very clear target will help provide that framework that Henry was talking about, that we now all know what we're aiming for. And we know what the purpose of the overall strategy is, and therefore how the local growth plans feed into that, rather than that's all a little bit vague. So we're sort of going to do this, and then another body does X, another body does Y, and things just don't integrate perhaps quite as well as what we might like. So I think more specific on that growth target from central government would be a good thing. I think second one, just building on what I was saying about sectors, I think we want to be trying to get the cutting edge of the economy growing. That's where productivity growth will come from in the future. We know that's what drives overall productivity growth. But whether that is in wearables or AI or something else, I'm probably a little bit more relaxed about. It's just the cutting edge that we want to grow. And indeed, I think the policy interventions we might make are probably very similar across those areas too. I think where that potentially becomes a little bit tricky, in particular for local growth plans, is that if the government comes out and says, here are 4 specific things that we really care about, but actually, Combined Authority X actually has 4 things elsewhere, how do those 2 things meet to come together? And in some ways, I think being so specific at the national level actually puts too much of a constraint, a straitjacket on local areas to talk about what they have got, or maybe what they haven't got, what they should be focusing on. And certainly in the 2018 version, I remember when local industrial strategies were being created, I think a lot of places then sort of reorientated what they were talking about into what the national strategy was all about. And I don't think necessarily is that helpful. So it's an element of just being aware, beware both at national and local level about how specific you go on these things. Third one, in terms of, it probably relates actually to the place one that I pulled out about what's the role of place. So I think the challenge that the national strategy has is it recognises how place is important and different places play different roles. It also has got a priority about sectors, but it doesn't necessarily merge those 2 things together to understand what that looks like. So I think there are 2 things within that for local growth plans to consider. The first is that I don't think that every local growth plan should be distinct. I think certainly if we talk about big cities, the challenges that they face are fairly similar. There will be some differences around the edges, but if the government receives a number of local growth plans that do look similar, and maybe you could rip out the name and put in a different large city, I wouldn't see that as a big concern. And that's a criticism that has been levelled at these things in the past. I think if Cornwall were the right one, and the Cornwall one looked exactly the same as Greater Manchester, I think we do have a problem. But if Greater Manchester's plan doesn't look too different than the North East one, I wouldn't be too worried about that, because I think, say, the challenges that big cities face are fairly similar. And then related to that, in terms of place, if the government is making a decision to say that different places play different roles in the national economy, and therefore we're going to favour or going to preference some places over others in terms of priorities. I think the combined authorities themselves have to recognise that too, that different parts of the combined authority play different roles, and perhaps some of the more rural elements of the combined authorities that do have that more rural element to them. And that's not where the productivity growth is going to come from. It's going to come from the city, but the city centres in particular. And therefore, making choices within the combined authority around place, I think, is going to be important, which politically is very hard to do. But I think that's how we maximise the chance of trying to improve prosperity in these places through the plans.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. So lots in that as well. Let's start to get into some of the questions or issues. Henry, maybe come back to you. You start us off. You talked about thinking about local growth plan and all the rest of it. Obviously, growth is the central word in the three words there. Paul raised this point about how we think about what we're trying to do, what we mean by growth. I mean, where are you as an MCA in thinking about what growth actually means, what it looks like in the Northeast?
Yeah, I actually hate coming on after Paul because he always bends my mind with his erudite answers to these questions. So you'll have to forgive me being a bit more basic. But so I think you pointed to a couple of areas of tension. So there is a need at a national level to be specific, to understand where the value add is, to not have a load of fake news plans that all say the same thing, to sort of sweat the combined authority model according to where you're actually going to get growth benefits from, start to enable them to collaborate, be super specific about where government resource needs to go and or the type of incentives you're going to need to unlock that kind of growth. At an MCA level, I'd be surprised if any of my colleagues said any different across the country. You need a growth plan to be more holistic than that. It needs to be about the story of a place. It needs to be about the foundation economy as much as it is about the high productivity, high GVA sectors and their potential. So these things have got to be a mix, and that's where that lovely dance comes in between understanding where actually you need a degree of collaboration, whether that's financial or not, between central government and the MCAs that is a higher order than you've got at the moment, and then areas where actually something like the single settlement or a wider transport settlement or more powers over skills might be the things that help you the most. And actually, I think we're having a really sensible conversation at the moment about that balance. In our region, we sort of split this. Well, I split this. I'm not sure this is a kind of natural split really, but we've got areas where we absolutely understand that we have big growth potential on the back of existing industrial clusters, and we understand the barriers to those to that growth accelerating or cluster growth. So some of those are physical. You could look at things like grid capacity. You could look at cables over the River Tyne. You could look at the extent to which the electricity grid underneath Nissan and the supplier park can cope with the scale of demand. You look at the amount of space we've got in Net Park for the next wave of manufacturing inward investment. They're really kind of physical barriers to investment and actual growth that we know we need to remove. We know we need certain relationship with central government in order to do it. We've got other areas where we would say we're probably at the front of our foreheads in terms of future growth in future sectors. So offshore wind to an extent is in that bucket, albeit there's a really clear dialogue with Crown Estates around leasing and around the capturing of that technology. But if you look at defence, satellite technology, the data centre that's just arrived in Northumberland, they're all examples of areas where we don't quite know what that cluster growth is going to look like. You might speak about culture and creative sector as well in the same bracket, but we know there's the potential there for IP development, content creation, the inward investment to become more than here's a nice place to build a big shed. We've got those areas, and then we've got areas where we know most of our jobs come from, frankly, which is the SME base, the foundation economy. About 40% of GDP goes on public services up here. So, go figure. The growth plan has to have a really clear account of how the sort of social policy push to improve the economy is served through our institutions and public services here too. So we try and be reasonably sophisticated about how we deal with that. I don't think we need the same kind of government intervention in all of those sectors. But there are some sectors in which we need very specific intervention and or prioritization, and that's what the growth plan should do. Yeah. Should be able to articulate those much more clearly.
And in that perspective, Henry, is it fair? So are you thinking then, your growth plan is pretty broad. As you say, it's a story of the place, which reflects all the things that you've just said that make up the place. And then you're thinking about the degree to which an industrial strategy, from the government can deliver aspects of that, but not necessarily all of that. Is that
Exactly
the way
right.
to think about it?
Exactly
Is that the way
right.
you're thinking about that?
Exactly right. Because otherwise, what are you? You're a cat at the light, aren't you? The next time a new framework comes out, you're developing a new story. And that's not, to go back to what Paul's just said, that doesn't feel either evidence-based or very sensible from our point of view. So if you want these deals to be, these devolution deals, I should say, to be, 30-year deals that deliver you a kind of really sensible long-term growth over time, rather than a thing that lasts 2 years before the next plan comes out, you absolutely have to write your local growth plan like that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you can't be then ultra specific with government about the areas that require additional incentives and or capacity or funding to unlock in the short run. And I don't think, we're not there yet, are we, in terms of the answering Victoria's question at a national level? If you look at the budget for growth didn't have many measures that would accelerate growth in it, did it? So I don't, it's not only us that's scratching for answers here.
Yeah.
I do think that local areas need to be as holistic as they can, because otherwise we are literally just another public agency jumping at the latest framework. And I don't think that's right at all.
And Henry, I mean, I come to Victoria and Paul and say, are you worried, maybe you're not, but are you worried that essentially you're kind of broader perspective, story of place perspective, when you interact then with government through the industrial strategy, essentially it will become constrained, or essentially all of the other stuff will be left to the side because they'll be particularly focused on the 8 sectors or certain things. Have you got a sense as to whether that, are you worried about that at this point?
To an extent, but you need a whole of area and whole of government approach on these things.
Right.
So I will be using the growth plan as a way of interacting with DWP and DFE and DEFRA just as much as I will DBT and OFI. And I mean, we're an acronym hell now, aren't we? But you get the point.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we see it in that way. Otherwise, what you get, and just to give you a slightly kind of comic anecdote, we in those early stages of the new government, we have that wonderful, the mayor's return from Downing Street, and we're developing a growth plan. Nobody's marking our homework. We're going to write what we need. And then the next question for us into government is, but what's the template? What's the deadline?
What should we put in it?
If we start behaving like that, devolution means now, does it? So actually, we have to be able to find the join between these things, but be really bold as regions about what we think is going to drive growth for us. It is a whole of government affair to unlock that, frankly. It's not going to happen through a series of measures that only sit within the industrial strategy.
Yeah, quite. Victoria, come in on this sort of, it's the sort of within the, what does growth mean to us in terms of whether you're government or whether you're a place? And then how do these sorts of things interact? What's your sort of perspective on that? There's a value to the narrowness in some respects, but it still needs to be complementary to the broader objectives or broader ambitions that places have got.
Yeah, so, I mean, thinking about growth, what underpins growth? In the main, it's the proportion of your population that are in employment and how productive is each of those individuals. Okay, so as Paul said, I think, Centre for Cities take would be that absolutely the industrial strategy should be focusing on productivity. And for lots of places, the focus should be on productivity too. But the challenge is, if you're a place where you've got a lower employment rate, then actually you're probably going to want to focus on employment as well. And it's hard when you're a policymaker in any field to stay narrowly focused on anything. The temptation is always to make sure that you're meeting all of your constituencies. And I think this is one of the potential points where there can be tension between these two things. I don't necessarily think that tension is a bad thing. I actually think it's just the reflection of a more mature system where you've got, accountability and action happening at multiple different levels. So if it was, I'm going to say the bad old days, but I'm not sure whether actually technically it's the bad old days. But, back when these things were almost deals or bidding documents that essentially, if the local growth plans were about each area trying to get a piece of the pie of whatever, money government was going to spend on the industrial strategy, you'd have brilliant alignment because everybody would say that what they were going to do was exactly the same as what government wanted to happen. In reality, if a local growth plan is what Henry talked about, which is the story of what a place thinks it needs to do, with the powers that it's got and, through lobbying for other changes, to achieve growth in that area, there are going to be some areas of difference, but probably not massive ones, because, as I said earlier, the industrial strategy is focused on a whole bunch of stuff that is sensible: skills, transport, having a good business environment, so going to be different things happening at the national and at the local level. But I actually think you'll probably end up with quite a lot of alignment. I do think the one real place where you might get tension is, so they've picked these broad sectors that they're going to focus on in the industrial strategy. It does say when we get to white paper, they're going to drill down into more detail, which I know slightly horrifies Paul. But I think you end up potentially with an issue if actually the way that ends up panning out is you end up with lots more investment in some areas than in others. Now, my suspicion is that all of the mayoral combined authority areas must probably have a good concentration of one or more of those priority sectors, but there'll be lots of bits in the country that don't. So I actually think down the line for government, that's most probably the area of tension. The one other thing I would say is there's lots of things in that, like financial and professional services, digital, etc., creative, where there's a bit of that everywhere. So absolutely everywhere is going to claim, importance in that. So government almost probably need to do quite a good job in terms of holding the line on that.
Yeah. Victoria, I'll come to Paul. Just to say, look, can you give, what's the sort of practical reality of the tension between, I don't know, employment because labour market participation is low, and a more overt focus on, productivity, value add growth, etc. How do you see that sort of in reality? I know you're not suggesting they're mutually exclusive, but what do you imagine the tension being in that scenario, Victoria? And you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought that was for Paul.
No.
I'm not sure there is a tension. If, as Henry said, the local, places are approaching their local growth plan as being, what do we need to do to grow our economy?
Right.
I think it's okay if actually the national strategy is focused on productivity, but local places say, yeah, we think that's important, and, we agree that, but we feel in our case, we also need to be doing some stuff about employment, So, but again, it's going to come down to what is the relationship between these two documents.
Yeah, and this is a really even harder question, tougher question. But in a big picture sense, are the types of intervention, based on the evidence that you constantly review and keep an eye on, are the types of interventions that support labour market participation and employment rate growth, as it were, are they quite different from interventions that might improve productivity value add at the firm level?
See, that's a really interesting question, actually. So for those who don't know our evidence base, what we do is we look for impact valuations that have used a counterfactual, because they're the ones where we're most confident that the outcomes that you see are due to the intervention. And we look on it on a policy by policy basis. So we look at all of the business advice policies, and then we look at all of the policies that support unemployed people into work, transport policies, etc. It is much, much more common for an evaluation to look at employment than it is to look at productivity. So I'm not sure I can really fairly say, these things are better for productivity or these things are better for employment, because number one, and funnily enough, this is the second briefing I've done, or webinar I've done today, and this is the second time I've actually had a variation of this question. We don't have any evaluations that say, in this case, we gave people business support or a grant to do R&D, and in this case, we funded transport scheme. So we don't have like for like comparisons, but we also just don't have nearly enough evidence on productivity outcomes coming from interventions. You get a bit more on kind of business advice, innovation stuff than you do on some of the others. The proxy that we tend to use for productivity is wages. That's not it's a proxy that we can use, but it's not the best proxy because not all productivity gains translate into wage gains.
Yeah, that's very good. Maybe the industrial strategy stroke local growth plans are a means by which we can improve the evidence base for those that come after us. And stand on the shoulders of the giants that are on the screen, not me included. Paul, come back on this growth sort of narrow productivity only. Give me the lens versus the bigger perspective, and then we'll move on to a couple of other issues around the specificness of the sectors versus the place aspect as well, because I'm quite interested in that.
Sounds like, nasty mean economist says only focus on productivity and forget about employment in the everyday economy, which is absolutely not the case. I think we're talking about tensions in that I don't think there necessarily, or there isn't a tension in this, but it's understanding what the mechanism looks like. And I think the tension probably comes, people invent a tension almost in this area because there isn't, I think, a good understanding of what the mechanism looks like between those high productivity sectors and those large employment sectors. And there's a question in the chat which sort of relates to this about the everyday economy. So 2017, wind the clock back to 2017-18. You and I, Andrew, no doubt, Henry and Victoria as well, sat in a number of meetings and panels talking about local industrial strategies and the national industrial strategy as well. And what tended to happen quite quickly in most of those meetings was that we would say, I want to go for growth and productivity growth. And then someone else would say, but that growth's got to be inclusive. And everyone went, that growth's got to be inclusive. So how are we going to do the inclusive bit? And it's a bit like, that's fine, but you've got to get the growth bit first. And I think there's a continued caution about putting the cart before the horse, that if you've got a place that hasn't been growing very well, which unfortunately is most of the country for the last 15 years, but for a place that have struggled even longer than that, the challenge is about getting that growth going. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore the inclusive elements, but please don't put the inclusive elements first and ignore the growth element, because really getting those bits right first, that we need before you bring in the inclusive stuff. And then you can bring in a whole range of interventions there around trying to do something about that. So the industrial strategy, and this is where the last one then fell down in 2017-18, is it's trying to do too many things, because people thought, the industrial strategy is going to do productivity, but it's also going to do employment. And by the way, it's going to do this, and by the way, it's going to do that. And then all of a sudden it becomes very diluted and no focus, and it can't really do anything. I think unfairly we expect that strategy to do too many things. So the first thing is to say is that industrial strategy is only one of the interventions. We've got hopefully a devolution white paper coming in the next couple of weeks, which may well give us some extra clarity on what devolution looks like. We had the Get Britain Working white paper yesterday as well, where this is all part of the broader government economic strategy. And so some of the interventions then around inclusive growth, we should definitely do them, but they're probably going to be through a labour market intervention rather than through an industrial strategy productivity intervention. So things like minimum wage, etc., which we saw some movement on in the budget, they're the types of things that you can do in terms of trying to make sure that that growth is felt by as broad a range of people as possible. But what of this mechanism? Because there's a direct link between those high productivity sectors and those high employment, everyday economy, local services type activities like cafes, bars and restaurants. Well, if you've got a strong tradable base, a strong exporting base that's bringing money into the economy, that then puts money in people's pockets, which can then go out and spend on local services. They can go to those cafes, bars, restaurants, they can go to the shops, they can go to the Christmas markets that might well be on now and go and pay for overpriced mulled wine, if that's what they so want to go and do. But that's how that employment effect is then generated and how these local services then benefit. So This is not the case of saying only focus on this part of the economy and to hell with every other part of the economy. It's actually saying you need that engine to be firing if you are then going to see sort of that broader growth then felt across other sectors, because those are the sectors that downstream from those that exporting base. You have to get that bit right first, and then bring the prosperity in underneath. I think too much the challenge for a lot of the places across the country, certainly outside the Greater Southeast, is that tradable base, that exporting base, is nowhere near as strong as what it needs to be. So the engines of prosperity in these places aren't really firing on all cylinders, and that has implications for the amount of money in people's pockets, and then the implications for how well the everyday economy or the local services sector then does as a result of that.
Brilliant. Okay, I feel like we could carry on this theme, but I'm going to artificially draw a line under it. We'll come back to it. I want to get to as well in the last sort of 10 minutes around how it connects, how we think about the industrial strategy, how it connects to other agendas. We've had a question on the announcements yesterday around the revisions to employment support and how that connects in. Henry, I know you've got some thoughts on that, and obviously there's devolution white paper scheduled for next week. So we'll come to how it connects to everything else, how we should think about that. But Henry, just as an aside, I mean, you're doing it and thinking about local growth plans at the Northeast scale. I mean, you are by definition, the MCA for the Northeast. Can you just give us a sense as to how that informs and then influences the way that you think about what the growth plan should have in it and what it should be focused on? There's a scale question, because obviously for the MCAs, it's relatively clear. Government's been pretty clear, on the MCAs and their role in all of this. For other places, less clear. So I'm just interested in your thought on that and how it's influenced the way you go about what you're doing.
I'm still reeling from Paul's transition to full red-blooded Chicago school Milton Friedman view of the world. To be honest, it might take me a few minutes to recover. No, so you're asking a question about the scale of the region and how. Yeah,
you're doing it you're doing it as the MCA. You're thinking about the Northeast, the area that you cover, which is quite a big area. Yep. Lots of urban, lots of rural, and everything in between. How has that affected the way that you then think about the area, the economy, and what's made up of it?
Oh, I mean, profoundly is the answer. Yeah. We can't pretend we are Greater Manchester in terms of the shape of the economy, the economic model that is needed to service it. Even the evidence base about where growth comes from through a devolved lens doesn't really fit with a Northeast that looks more like Wales than it does Greater Manchester in terms of its political economy, the way it sort of functions. I would go back to so. What that doesn't mean is we create a growth plan that is sort of magical thinking about the fact that Wooler and Berwick are going to become centres of productivity in the region in the near future.
Yeah.
What it does mean is we focus on what you would expect, which is how we're going to maximise productivity and growth within our 3 urban areas, within the 3 cities. How do you create a transport network that facilitates that? How do you unlock growth, both through kind of unlocking land and the potential for at-scale investment in our ports, around our airport? How do you make sure that you've got the big sectors in the region like automotive, offshore wind, advanced manufacturing really firing on all cylinders? So there's not, you look at that plan coming through, it will not contain lots of wild and whimsical things about the transformation of the Northumberland National Park into a business park. So you kind of work with a grain to an extent. It has to deal with the interdependencies that we just talked about. So, in order to, and actually they're really sort of interesting in a region like ours. If you look at the relationship between, let's say, Duke of Northumberland decides to rewild 30% of his land in Northumberland, the impact in terms of being able to then carbon offset for firms in the city who can't do it locally is a really interesting economic, what's the word, kind of thread or balloon for us, So there's, and of course you are, as a region, dealing in your position within a really important corridor too. So offshore wind, Dogger Bank, relationship with Scotland in terms of energy, and Teesside and the Humber, So they're all things that they do speak to the scale of the region and its position, connecting, well, as a kind of connector within the UK, as well as the connections between parts of the region itself. We've been very careful not to do pretendy. So we don't have every leader of every local authority saying, here's what I get out of it, and here's what I get out of it. And it takes a while to get to a mature discussion about growth and what it means and how you get it and how the benefits of that are distributed. And I have to give credit to the political team up here. You know, they've spent a long time working out what their model of devolution is about, and the notion that you have to have a model of growth that is credible and doesn't necessarily work for everywhere at the same time is a kind of a basic principle, but it's a fundamental part of what we're doing. And then I'd say to go back to your kind of question in a way, Andy, we shouldn't be trying to do everything with this piece of work. You know, we've said that, we've all said that in a number of different ways. For us, you know, with 25% of women economically, actually it's about 28-29% now of women economically inactive in the region, about a quarter of the population, 40% of kids knocking on experiencing poverty at some point in their life within the urban core. You know, we have to have interventions to support this that come through other means. So the DWP announcements yesterday, really welcome, long fought for. We'll see more of that within the white paper coming through as well. So it's a mix, but having a mature dialogue regionally about what growth means and the evidence base for that and what's credibly going to drive it rather than hit and hope is completely fundamental to getting this right, I think. And that is the bit that you would expect as well colleagues within Whitehall to be really focused on. So I would absolutely expect, you know, it's a classic Whitehall stroke Cabinet Office role, isn't it, to quality assure across the piece.
Yeah,
that's what we want. You know, we want our colleagues in Whitehall to be going, well, you're having a laugh there, but actually we could see an investment case here. We could, and we've had a fair bit of practice of that. If you look across the last two devolution deals, the work to support the auto sector, Nissan, Crown Works Studios, you know, they're examples of kind of cocktails of investment and incentives that we've created with central government, which is exactly the kind of thing you'd want to see coming out of, and of course the private sector is the substantial part of that. It's exactly the kind of thing you'd want to see coming out of these growth plans and this industrial strategy. I would go back though as a final point, sorry, to like what does it do? You know, I'm all for strategy that's evidence-based and coherent and that lands and feels like a version of the truth, but there's also a really tactical and specific question we've got to answer, which is, what do we expect this to do? So from my point of view, I'm saying, okay, this needs to be right because it unlocks these specific funding streams for sector support, or it unlocks us having a more productive conversation with DBT about trade missions within particular sectors, or it frames the single settlement or what. But it's you know, cut the middle bit, what we're actually trying to do with this, and that is the bit that needs to become clearer in the next iteration. Yeah,
that's a very good point. Very good point. Victoria, come in on slightly on it. So we've had a couple of questions about you know, the industrial strategy as is relatively clear. A big stress on place. All three of you have said that. Relatively clear of the role that the MCAs play as institutions and custodians of their place in marshalling the evidence and drawing together growth plans. Less clear, I suppose, on other areas and what's expected of them. In terms of your engagement with places across the country on, you know, what should be in it, do you notice a difference, I suppose, at this stage between some of the bigger MCA type places and some of the small places? What kind of support or advice are you providing to them?
So I think, because it's hard to generalize, but I think there's definitely places that have been at this a long time.
Yeah.
That have good institutional structures, you know, that have good capacity, you know, for whom this is not their first rodeo, that I would say are taking a similar approach to what Henry's described for North East, which is they're thinking, this is a good opportunity for us to revisit. And I think revisit is quite an important word, actually, because this is not starting from a blank piece of paper. It's not, you know, oh, shall we look at the evidence about, you know, how our area is doing? You know, places know this, so it's iterating on things that they've already got in place. So I think there's definitely a cohort for whom they're approaching this in a pragmatic way, which is saying, this is a good opportunity, especially given where we are, you know, post-Brexit, post-COVID, you know, now's probably a good time to be sitting, you know, reflecting, reiterating, pulling together something that's coherent.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there is probably other places that we're engaging with where it is much more tactical. It is much more in the government's publishing an industrial strategy and it's talking about these things as priorities and what should we be feeding in as our kind of, you know, our top priorities that align with that. So I think there's definitely a variation. And I think, you know, so Megan Streb, who's our head of outreach, spends, you know, the vast majority of our time, you know, with MCAs and with local authorities. You know, a lot of it is quite, you know, sometimes people will come and ask if we would comment on a strategy, you know, if we would look at something. But she often positions the support that we provide as come and have an early chat with us. You know, not much point giving us a strategy that's kind of a week away from being signed off. You know, come and kick some ideas around with us. And I think the other thing that, you know, we've obviously got resources on our website that are useful, you know, stuff about how to think about approaching the evidence base. We've also got all of the evidence reviews that kind of tell you about, you know, kind of what does the evidence tell us about what works for different policies. So definitely we've done a page on the website to kind of pull all of that together and also to signpost to other things that people, you know, have written that we think are useful. So I don't know, for those that don't know, we're a very small team. There aren't masses of us, but we just try to be as proactive as possible in terms of having early discussions with places and people.
Okay, very good. Paul, come in on this, and then we'll get to the link to everything else issue. But just on the sort of scale, I mean, we think a lot about scale. We place a lot of importance on scale within and geography within both between places and within places. Obviously, the MCAs provide a scale and a geography that we think is broadly sensible. Outside of the MCAs, it's much more variable, and that does affect the way then that people think about economy and interventions and, you know, all the rest of it. So just say a little bit about where, you know, where our thinking is on that, and then we'll sort of finish on how does this link to everything else that we know is ongoing.
Well, different places do play different roles in the national economy. You know, the question is, how far from that potential are places, and what does that then mean from what policy should do? And I think the Green Paper recognises that when it talks about particularly underperformance in big places, that they are far from that potential, and that means there's room for policy to intervene and do something on that. But what I also think it then means is that the industrial strategy probably has more value to some places rather than others. So, you know, at the national level, we need to try to get more out of Greater Manchester than probably what we're going to get out of rural West Wales. The industrial strategy is going to mean more in that respect. And even at MCA level, as Henry was saying earlier, probably the industrial strategy will have more to say for central Newcastle than it will for the north part of Northumberland or the Northumberland National Park. Having said that, you know, within that, it's a bit like the link between high productivity sectors and high employment sectors. There's a mechanism going on here, you know, that people we mustn't lose sight of. And just because the economy is located very deliberately in some very specific places, it doesn't mean that the benefits from that are kept by the people who live in those very specific places. So we go down very micro to, say, Newcastle city centre. Clearly, the people who work in the high value jobs that exist in Newcastle city centre, a large share of them will not live in Newcastle city centre. Probably don't even live in Newcastle. They live in some of the very nice towns just to the north of Newcastle. The problem that we see in the northeast or the northwest or wherever is that those big places are not generating as much prosperity as what they should do, and then that prosperity is therefore then not being spread through the mechanisms that we see, especially around London. If you think about all of the very affluent areas outside of London where the economy doesn't exist there to the same extent it does in London, but the fruits of the London's economy definitely exist there because they flow into the pockets of people who take those jobs in London and then decide to live a little bit further out. So it's understanding, again, that mechanism and how all these things play out and having a framework for understanding things rather than just everywhere's got to be the same. I know you've got a bit of that growth sector, so we've got to have that growth sector as well. I think it's much more understanding that different places do play different roles, and your strategy is then tailored both nationally and locally to that.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. So,
Andy, can I just add
go on, Henry. Go on,
one thing to that, which is just the importance of changing the mood music on how areas, whether it's cities or stroke local authorities or MCAs, interact with government. It is a really profound shift, moving from recognizing everything Paul said, but then ultimately having a competitive funding stream where you're bidding against each other, and night follows day, and getting to a scenario where you've got a more grown-up discussion about funding allocate. I know funding's not everything, but that is a more grown-up discussion about the allocation of resource to support growth.
Yeah,
it's a really big thing.
And Henry, are you encouraged in the conversations thus far? Obviously, what happens in the future happens in the future, but are you encouraged in the conversation you've had so far around that recognition that we need to move away from these zero-sum, destructive, competition-based allocation?
I think we're in a better place than we were. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating and all of that down the line. I think our issue is going to be about the quantum of resource that's available rather than the mechanism this time around, if I'm honest. But I think that's an important shift.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you started. So good. We had a question almost right at the beginning from Ian Cruz, and you started because we were talking about this before we came on air. So the Get Britain Working white paper was launched yesterday and is focused on driving growth through employment. Having read through the summary, there is little mention of the industrial strategy. Do you find it concerning that there's a lack of joined-up delivery, especially when addressing skills deficits in growth sectors? So that's sort of Ian's specific question, but it touches on the broader points that you were making, which is actually we need to see how these things Get Britain Get Britain Working paper, industrial strategy, devolution white paper next week, etc. These things need to come together, and we need to think about how to do that. And you're probably better placed than government to do that. So, just your thought on the joined upness.
My answer is in your question. I would say you cannot do that joining up without thinking about a more devolved way of working across government. End of. I think it's okay that you have, of course, different white papers, policy positions coming from different departments, but the only way you're going to be able to join up the skills system with how responsive higher education is, for example, to local employers, with the areas. I mean, at a fundamental level, you're looking at two very different ways of treating human capital in the regions and incentives for economic growth in the regions. And if we're going to create jobs and not able to then align the skill system around them, either for now or for the future, that's a bit of a ridiculous position, isn't it? So I don't think you can deliver an industrial strategy properly without more devolution and more departmental buy-in to the idea that that's the fulcrum for it all.
Yeah. Victoria, come in on this, in a sense of trying to think about how these things knit together. And I suppose in part, Henry's point, whose responsibility and where should we have the expectation of knitting all these things together? It's often said government needs to do that. I don't think government can do that except in very exceptional circumstances. I think MCA is by definition a better place to do it. But I'm just interested in your thought about the degree of integration, joined upness, and how do we deal or improve that situation?
There's something quite interesting here. So at the national level, what we have is an industrial strategy. But then at the local level, what we've talked about is local growth plans. So to me, an industrial strategy would always be about the productivity end of the growth equation, whereas growth is broader. Okay. And when I was reading the industrial strategy, or at least one of my read-throughs of it, something that occurred to me was it's kind of interesting. It doesn't just talk about the sectors, it doesn't just talk about the places, it does talk about these things like transport and skills. It talks about them in a very specific manner, and there's some things that are mentioned but other things that are not. So I think there's just an interesting dynamic about how these things get segmented up. So I 100% think we need to be doing something nationally about economic inactivity. We need to be tackling that. I just don't see where it happens other than at the local level, whether that is, a combined authority, or, some other geography. But it seems to me that that's the place that it most logically happens.
Yeah.
The place where it is manageable. to make it happen, actually, I think.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I add to Victoria's point just briefly, Andy? Because I really agree with that. I think I don't want to come across as saying this with hubris, if you know what I mean, because actually this isn't about Whitehall's got some stuff, devolve it and do it all at our level. It's about coordination as much as anything else, and about the strength of collaboration and using, if you have this model that is based around notionally a functional labour market area that makes sense from an economic point of view, you've got to start sweating that, haven't you, and start using that as a coordination point for policy across the board. Otherwise, you're always going to get mismatched accountability, and you can't then improve the productivity of either the economy or, frankly, government practice within the regions if you don't. So there's a bit about using the, sweating the model that we've got. I think there's big gains, even if you're not formally devolving through that lens, of using MCAs as almost as a design principle within public policy.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a very good point. Paul, I mean, final kind of thoughts around, how does this all join up? We spend a lot of time obviously thinking about the interaction between devolution white paper and industrial strategy white paper as it will become, because we know that some of the factors that are going to drive productivity at the local level are essentially going to be through the devolution agenda, not necessarily through the industrial strategy agenda as it's currently organised through government. So just say a little bit more about that how we bring some of that together, where we do it, how we do it.
Well, it's certainly understanding that the industrial strategy isn't meant to be doing everything, like I was saying earlier, and so those different interventions will lean into that or indeed solve other problems that we might well face. I think the important thing is understanding how those things fit together, and I think that's probably the element where we haven't got a strong sense of that at the moment, about how all these different pieces fit to achieve overall what the government wants to achieve. It probably has got that vision internally, but I don't think that probably has been expressed maybe quite so clearly, and there's a little bit of work to be done on that. I think from the MCA perspective, the Combined Authority perspective, there's probably also a question about, with relatively limited resources, what do you think is going to have the biggest payoff? Is it about writing your local growth plan, or is it about getting your single settlement over the line? And where do you think the bigger resources are to achieve what you want to achieve? And no doubt, colleagues are thinking about that currently, and I think that is definitely worth reflecting on. And I think it's great, as Henry said, government's not marking homework this time around the way that was definitely the case in 2017-18 when we last did the industrial strategy dance. But no doubt there still will be a lot of tuning back and forth with government about, say this word rather than saying that word when it comes to publishing them. And there was a question of, is the time better spent, arguing, quibbling over those words as the bigger prize on some of those other things that are in place. So internally, I'm sure there are discussions going on about, where should Combined Authority be placing their efforts currently in order to unlock that growth that they're trying to unlock.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think all of you said, at the beginning and throughout, it's work in progress. It's a process to be worked through and to be developed and iterated rather than a moment in time. And as we see components of where the new government's thinking is, actually being able to knit some of those together as they become clearer, I think is also, as you were saying, Henry, that is the important role that the MCAs will have to play over time in being able to knit together the different agendas and make them real and meaningful on the ground. So I think there's, as always, there is plenty to be doing both in the short term and in the long term. But it's 1 o'clock, so we need to finish this particular session. So a huge thanks to Henry and to Victoria and to Paul as always. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attendance. And until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks very much.